Tick tack, it's my clock telling me I should get up. I should get up.
Hi, and welcome to The Conscious Loop, where woo-woo and the real world collide. I'm your host, Katrina DeAngelis. Join me as we explore what it looks like to live consciously almost always. Each episode, we dive into transforming mindsets and shifting paradigms through topics such as developing self-awareness, living authentically, communication, strengthening relationships, and leading from the inside out. If you're ready to break out of your unconscious loops and discover what else is possible, you came to the right place. You ready? Let's dive in. I'm so excited to welcome Jacqueline Lane to the show. She is the president of 100 Coaches Agency, an organization dedicated to amplifying the collective impact of the world's most iconic leaders, thinkers, and executive coaches. She is also the author of a book called Becoming Coachable, which she wrote with Scott Osmond and Marshall Goldsmith. I am excited to dive in a little bit more to not just the book, but also relationship versus philosophy, and get to know Jacqueline on a more personal level and share her own leadership journey to becoming the president of 100 Coaches Agency. So without further ado, let's dive in. Jacqueline, it's so good to have you here on The Conscious Loop. I was thinking I would love to hand it over to have you introduce yourself, but I wanted to even share the audience how we met because I just think it's so cool and I love sharing those stories. We were on a call, I think for something completely unrelated, an app orientation call, and Jacqueline's talking and I see her screen lighting up and I notice your background and I'm like, that looks so familiar, that book. And sure enough, I look closer and I'm like, oh yeah, I've had that book like saved on my Amazon account to want to purchase, being in the coaching and consulting space. And here I am sitting with the author of it. And so I had reached out and you were so kind and excited to connect as well. And it's led us here. And the reason I love sharing those stories is because I think it's such a reminder that there's so many ways to create connection. And I think there's sometimes fear around that. What if I reach out or say something and they're not really interested? And it's so rare that you have that experience. But I just wanted to share, it's rare that you have an experience where somebody isn't interested. But I also notice when I do reach out to somebody and there is so much energy around it that just lights me up. And that's how I felt with you. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, I would love for you to introduce some of the work that you do and a bit about who you are in the world. And we'll kick it off from there.
Thank you so much, Katrina, for having me. This is really fun. I love those connections too. And I'd say the best part about writing a book is that some of those connections are starting to happen more and more frequently. And I know for me, books have been a really pivotal part of so many different journeys in my own life and experience. And I remember reading so many different books and going, oh, I wish I could thank the author. I wish I could meet them someday. I would tell them how much some of their work has had an impact on me. And I, now being in the world of coaching and consulting, feel so lucky to have met so many of those people and to get to tell them just how impactful their work is. And now it's a very funny thing to be in the other seat and to be on the receiving end of that, and to learn that the words that we share, the work that we do, has a life beyond us and can reach people that we may never know. And so I'm just so happy that we did get a chance to meet and connect, and what a wonderful connection it has been. To give a little bit of background on me, I am currently the president of the 100 Coaches Agency, which is created by a gentleman named Marshall Goldsmith, who some people may have heard of. He's recognized as the #1 executive coach in the world and created a lot of the methods and approaches that most executive coaches use today. Things like the 360 assessment or any other stakeholder-centered coaching, and this idea of how do you work with all of your key stakeholders and collecting feedback and incorporating them to the coaching process. Marshall's ideas have been spread far and wide. And some of his best-selling books were actually some of the ones that deeply impacted me early in my corporate career. What Got You Here Won't Get You There, or How Women Rise. And I remember maybe 6-ish years ago when I was in one of those corporate jobs, I read one of those books and it was so deeply impactful to me that I did think to myself, I hope to someday get the chance to shake Marshall's hand and say thank you. And now, 6 years later, I work very closely with Marshall. My business partner, Scott Osmond, and I work with Marshall closely. And the three of us together wrote Becoming Coachable and launched that in September of last year. And what an amazing journey it's been. We're just thrilled. The book is now a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And we're just loving talking about this topic because we realize that in some of the work that we're doing, the collection of top leaders, leadership thinkers, and leadership coaches at the 100 Coaches Agency, that there are so many books and so many people talking about how to be a better coach, whether that's you have a coaching practice or the leader showing up as a coach to their employees. But the interesting thing is that we didn't see anything written about how to be on the other side of that kind of a relationship, which is essentially how to be coachable. We decided to write that book, and that's what's led us here.
I love that. And I think it's so important too, because even as a coach, you still have to be coachable, right? So it's like something that everybody can get so much value from. And I think that's such a part of a coaching relationship. I have so many questions on the book, but you caught my interest with something else that you had shared as well, that I want to dive into before we dive more into the book. You mentioned that there was a point where you were reading those books. And by the way, I love what got you here won't get you there. I feel like I use that phrase, and it just is such a core component of my life and coaching practice as well. So I really love that one. How did you create that experience for yourself where there was a moment in your life where I hope that one day I get to shake Marshall's hand, to actually creating that, right? What led you there, and what do you think turned that into a reality and not just a thought?
I think the short answer is divine intervention, but the longer answer is that we all have opportunities and turning points, and sometimes we can listen to that inner guidance that tells us that we have a passion in a certain area, or we're feeling drawn to something inexplicably. I'm a chemical engineer by training, just about the furthest thing you could imagine from the world of coaching, consulting, and leadership thinking. And I was working in the energy industry in corporate America. Again, it's just about as far removed as can be from the world that I now inhabit. So it's just a very funny thing that all these different inflection points, these decision points have appeared where I realized in reading some of these books, I do really care about people issues. And it was this realization that human issues are at their core sustainability issues, but they're often the most complex and the most overlooked. And so I decided that I can still use my engineering training, my engineering mindset to solve some of those human problems. So I guess that just took me in a slightly different direction away from traditional engineering. But then to learn about the world of coaching, primarily through my husband, who had become an executive coach several years prior. So I started to hear through the grapevine some of the things that are happening. And I remember like putting my ear to the door when my husband is having some coaching sessions and learning about some of these conversations, feeling like I could be a fly on the wall to the world of executives and how they process some of the things that are going on in their lives. And then decided to make the leap right at the start of the pandemic. I realized that I didn't want to be in the energy industry any longer, but I didn't exactly know where I was going to land. And I had mentioned some of my interests to a few friends. And of course, through a friend of a friend, I got introduced to Scott. And Scott shared, he had created the 100 Coaches community with Marshall several years prior. And he shared this vision for creating the 100 Coaches Agency. And in an instant, I felt this call, and it said, and I said out loud in a moment of boldness that is maybe a little uncharacteristic for me. I said, not only do I completely see the vision for what you're trying to create, I think I'm the person to help you build it. And very fortunately, Scott agreed. And that was the beginning of our work together.
Wow. Yes. Such a powerful story. And as you were talking, it was like, I'm noticing, I'm reflecting on everybody that I've had the opportunity to interview. And there's this commonality of following the breadcrumbs of curiosity and being willing to just go for it. Whereas I think fear or different mindsets can pop in and be like, this is so different from what I'm doing now. Like, how can this work? Shifting from that to how can I expand what I'm doing, and how can I pivot and apply this to a different area that I'm super passionate about and be lit up by that. And so I'm curious, if there was any maybe moments along the way where you did struggle with that transition, and what can people do if they are in that space where I don't quite feel like I am where I want to be anymore. It got me here, but it's not going to get me to the next place in my journey. And so any advice that you would have to share for people?
It's such an individual journey, and I think everyone's a little bit different. So I'll certainly share some of my story and experience, but I totally recognize that what works for me or lessons that I may have learned may not apply to others. Um, for in my case, it was a clear moment of guidance. I had a dream, and in that dream, I saw myself still working in corporate America, and I could tell I'd made it. I was sitting in the corner office. You could see the wood paneling on the walls, and I was looking around this like immaculate office, going, "Wow, I finally did it. I did the thing I set out to do." And then I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the window, and I didn't recognize myself. And that was a very telling moment for me where I realized I had made some compromises along the way to rise to that level. To get where I had wanted to go, I had to sacrifice some things that were important to me. And in that moment in my dream, I realized that wasn't a price I was willing to pay. And so I remember waking up from it, and I knew pretty immediately that I had roughly 2 weeks before the powerful realizations that had set in that dream would start to fade, and I might just fall into some of my more normal habits of being. So I knew I had only about 2 weeks to do something. And that was the time where I had some hard conversations and decided to leave that job. But I'm glad I did it. And but maybe for some people, burning the ships so quickly may not be the way to go. But certainly for my personality type, I needed to know that that was not going to be my path. I needed to essentially close that door for myself. And amazingly, another door within a month or two began to open. Very blessed for that guidance.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I love what you said about inner guidance. And that was you having that insight through a dream and also through being willing to do something with that dream and with that information. Was you continuing to follow that inner guidance, right? Whereas for somebody else, yeah, maybe it's going about it a different way. But the important part, I think, is the being willing to do something about it with the information and not just sit with it and let it eat away or fester and bother you, right? So I really acknowledge you for that. It takes courage, and yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Let's talk about the book a little bit. When you were writing it, was there anything that surprised you, or maybe you had a theory of where it was going to go, but it took a different direction, or just you learned different things along the way? What are some sort of moments of surprise that came up in that book?
Yeah. So I'll tell you the part or the book is separated into three main sections. Sections 1 and 2 were what we thought was going to be the whole of the book. Section 3 was written after we completed sections 1 and 2 and realized this was not complete yet. There was more. So just to give you a little bit of overview, the first section is just some background information on coaching, trying to demystify the world of executive coaching. What is it? How is it different from things like mentoring or therapy? Just trying to help people understand the landscape. Because then when we get into the middle section of the book, that's the section of the book titled Becoming Coachable. And that's all about that process, that four-step framework we call our openness framework, which is if you can do these 4 things, you can be truly open to 4 things, then you are coachable. And so that's the middle piece. And that was where we anticipated ending the book. But then we realized there was this third section that was waiting to be written. We got to the end of those first 2 sections and said, to what end? Why does any of this really matter? And that became the title for the third section of the book, is all about to what end. And we really started to understand the different styles of leadership and the ways of being in the world, and how if someone does become coachable, what is it that they are accomplishing? What is it that they're unlocking? And our whole theory or the whole finding there was it's all about human flourishing. And we can create that not just for ourselves, but for all the people around us, all the people we care about, because we are so much more interconnected than we could possibly realize. And so that third section of the book is a very fun exploration of that.
I love that. Can you share what are the 4 things that you need to be coachable? And having those 4 things, what could that look like? To what end?
Yeah. The 4 steps in our openness framework are pretty self-reinforcing. So the first step, of course, is you have to be open to change. If you're not open to change, you don't want anything to change, then it's hard to engage in the process of becoming coachable. It's hard to want to go anywhere, right? Because you want things to stay as they are. But the world around us is constantly changing. Change is an imperative. It's just a fact of life. And so often that's the first barrier that a coach will help someone overcome, is their resistance to change. But once you are well and truly open to change, the next step that follows logically from that is being open to feedback. And this is where I think executive coaching often differs from other types of coaching, because there is an emphasis on collecting feedback from key stakeholders, especially in a professional setting. And those stakeholders have a lot of insight into how it is that we live and we lead. There are things that we simply can't see in ourselves. And so we can't be truly self aware without the reflections of other people. And those reflections of other people are just called feedback. And feedback doesn't have to be a negative thing, it can be a positive thing. But all feedback, really at its core, is a gift. And we have to come to terms with that and be open to receiving that feedback. And that's the important next step. The third step is, as you said earlier, Katrina, you have to be open to then making change. You have to take action on that change, right? In order to make anything come to fruition in your life. So I think taking action is then the logical third step. And finally, and this is probably the most challenging step of all, is you have to be open to being held accountable, because change is great, but lasting change is what we're all really after. And for most of us, change doesn't stick. We're so easy to revert into bad habits or old ways of being or patterns of thinking unless we have new systems and people in place and new patterns that can reinforce us the right way. It's quite simply the difference between living in an unconscious loop or living in a conscious loop, right? That accountability piece we find is really important. And if you have those 4 things and you're open to those 4 things, then congratulations, you're coachable.
I love it. You're coachable. What does that look like? Because I would imagine it is very different for an executive versus maybe somebody a little bit earlier in their career. What are some of the most common unconscious loops that executives might have to break free from to be coachable? Or even if they are coachable, like unconscious loops that they really have to break free from to be that next best version of themselves or leader. And you mentioned there's different styles of leadership. So I'm curious how that plays a role, because I know for sure early and middle career, I see a lot like only being comfortable in one style of leadership and not recognizing maybe when the other ones could be beneficial. And I would imagine that might create patterns by the time you do get to an executive level. So I'm curious, how does that show up, and what unconscious loops are pretty common for executives, and how can they rewire that into a more conscious one?
I think there are a few major unconscious loops that appear over and over in some of the work that we do. The first one that I see is when leaders think that they have all the answers or feel the pressure to have all the answers, right? They see that as either a mark of intelligence or leadership, that it's their job to have everything figured out. But really, that idea that you have to have all the answers and have everything figured out is just another limiting belief. And when you can release that, let go of that often unconscious belief, it's amazing that you can tap into the creativity and the information, the knowledge of all the people around you. And that starts to become a lot more conscious way to lead, where you're bringing all people along with you. Everyone's more bought in. It's amazing how just it seems like it would be a very small shift, creates an entire culture change in an organization. And similar to that is this idea, I think negativity is another one, where someone is very quick to shoot ideas down and to say, this is the way we've always done it, or that's not going to work, and here's why, rather than letting people, again, bring their own brilliance and try new things. So that's another small shift that creates a really big difference. But I think, too, the third one is around pride, taking a slightly more humble stance. Again, admitting when we don't know things, waiting for other people to speak up and to share. That's another incredibly powerful shift from unconscious to conscious that has an enormous impact in an
Yeah,
organization.
absolutely. Those when I hear you speaking about it, it's almost obvious how important those shifts could be, but then in actuality and in reality, it is so difficult, right? And it's harder, I think, to see the value of it when you're in it, because we're protecting ourselves in some way. There's some underlying fear that keeps you in that pressure to have all the answers. If I don't have the answers, maybe it'll look like I don't know, or I don't deserve to be here. Or if they have the answer and I didn't come up with it, then maybe that's also sometimes where that negativity bias comes in, because it's almost like, why didn't I think of that? Or there could be so many stories underneath it. These are just some of the ones that I've heard. I'm curious, what would you say to somebody right now? And I think this is something that at any level people can relate to, in the pressure to have the answers, that negativity by shutting things down. I think we all experience that in some way, some more than others. So I'm curious, like, what might somebody need to hear to know that it's okay to shift that behavior? And what does it look like once it's shift? Because I think people know what they think it's going to look like. That's the fear, right? That it's going to actually be something negative. So, what would they need to hear to be okay to be willing to shift that behavior? And what does it actually look once you step into that new behavior?
Everyone's a little different, and this is what I love about the field of coaching, is that there are many different coaching styles and approaches, but when there's often that perfect coach and leader match, magic happens. The coach knows how to unlock the leader in a way that they never knew could be there before. And so for some people it can just be asking a question like, does it really have to be that way? Because it can just be such a deeply unconscious belief that someone just asking, does it need to be that way, can really open them up. Or another exercise that I love is, what's the absolute worst that could happen? Let's just talk about that now. Let's suggest that someone else on your team comes up with an idea and it's brilliant. What's the worst that could happen? And then as you start to really talk about that and go through it and say, if they get the credit, then I look like I'm not the smartest person in the room or whatever. And you can go down that rabbit trail. But it's actually amazing how often we think things in our head are going to be much worse than they might be in reality. And so just talking that through out loud and realizing, oh, I have definitely spiraled this in my mind or made it bigger than it needs to be, helps them realize that, oh, I can try something new and it's going to be okay, because even if my greatest fears are realized, they're not so bad. And another piece that I advocate for a lot is things like a 360 assessment, just collecting feedback from other people. And that's, again, that second step in our openness framework. And this is an especially important one for me, because I have historically been resistant to feedback, seen feedback as somewhat of a punitive exercise. I think a lot of us have a visceral reaction to the word feedback. When someone says, can I give you some feedback? We often tense up a little bit and prepare for the worst. But the reality is, the jam can't read the label on the jar, a well-known saying in the world of marketing. That there are simply things that we can't see about ourselves. And so when we're confronted with, let's say, an anonymized 360 report where a coach has collected a bunch of different feedback on each of us as a leader, and we're faced with that, we often realize, oh, I didn't even realize the impact I was having, and that it was making people feel diminished, or that it was making people feel like they couldn't bring their ideas to the table. And just that realization, again, naturally helps shift them in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So powerful. And I'm right there with you. I feel like getting feedback can feel like a scary thing. I would imagine, as you know, as well, I think it feels scarier when you're getting it maybe unsolicited or you didn't ask for it, because it can come off as a surprise. But I think the more willing we become to seek it out and ask for it, then it just becomes like building that muscle. And I would encourage anyone, right? No matter where somebody is in their leadership journey, like the sooner you start building that, by the time you do get to an executive level or position, you've already built that muscle. And just a little plug in for people listening as well. Start to think about what are some of the muscles that you can be building, even if it's like your first day on the job, if you're just starting your career, if you're starting a new company at a higher level, if you're an executive, there's things that you can always start doing today. It's never too late. It's never too early. And I love these conversations because I always get something from it as well. So even as we speak, I'm like, oh, I could do that a little bit better, or yay, I'm doing that okay. Give yourself appreciation too for the things that you're doing well. And I think that's the part of the feedback too, right? It's, you said feedback can be a scary thing, but it's not always negative, right? You want to know what you're doing well too, so that you can amplify that, do more of that, and leverage that as well. So I like that.
Exactly. It goes both ways. And it's always powerful. It's always illuminating.
Yeah.
We have another saying here at the agency from my co-author, Scott. He always has the saying, ask, don't wonder. If he ever finds himself going, I wonder if, or I wonder what they think, that's like the key phrase where he goes, ask, don't wonder.
I
And
love
that has
that.
yielded some really, really great conversations.
Yeah, because it's almost, if you're wondering, then it's probably a story, right? If you're wondering, then it's not a fact. And so it's such a quick way to really shift you out of that story or fact. And if you don't have the fact, then you ask the question. And I've had so many conversations with my business partner, husband, friends, parents, like so many times where I'm assuming something and I just say it and this is what I'm feeling. And oftentimes it's like it's the complete opposite. And it's almost shocking. Like I'm not surprised anymore, but I remember in the earlier days of doing that, just being shocked at how often I actually got it wrong. And so that's so powerful. Ask, don't wonder. I want to transition actually to something that we were speaking about last week, which I just thought was so fascinating. And it's on this idea of time and shifting how we perceive time, reality. And before I even say anything else, I would love for you to share. I know it came out of a really powerful conversation as well. So I would love to just dive into that a little bit as the last little segment of our time here together.
Yeah, I'm so passionate about this topic, and I think it springs so naturally from this idea of becoming coachable, that when we engage with other people, especially in this process of collecting feedback and asking for accountability, and we realize how interconnected we are with other people and how important those relationships are to everything we do. At its core, business is a human endeavor. It's all about relationships. And I was on vacation with my husband a few years ago, and we were with a lovely elderly couple. And he had a bit of a health issue, and we had to go to the urgent care. And I remember as we're sitting in there in the waiting room in the urgent care, he says, I've just been reflecting a lot about life. I've lived a very long life. And I'm trying to think, what is there anything that we get to take with us beyond this lifetime? And my first reaction, of course, in that moment is something like, oh, no, we don't take anything with us. And he says, I actually think there is one thing. I think we take our relationships with us. I think most of us innately know that our relationships last beyond this lifetime. And that was a really profound moment. And the more and more I've thought about that, the more I think that's true. And so I've been playing around with this idea in terms of 3D or 5D, 4D, 5D. So in the 3D world, this is the world of things that you can touch and feel, right? Spatial awareness and all of these things that we can see and have a sense of. And that's the world in which transactions happen, right? I give you goods or money in exchange for goods and services. Transactions are a natural course of the way that we go about an exchange in this world. And then when you add the fourth dimension, which is time, then a transaction over time is what most people would call an investment, right? I'm going to give you something now, and you're going to give me something greater later. And that's how we typically think of long-term investment strategy. But then there's this fifth dimension, this dimension that transcends time, and that is that dimension of relationships. And so if relationships transcend the world of transactions or investments, then that's the kind of frame of mind I want to live in. And it makes certain things, even in the business world, feel very clear to me in a moment where I say, is this a relationship first decision? Is this a decision that maximizes the most valuable thing of all, which is relationships? And so we have at the 100 Coaches Agency, we often refer to ourselves as a relationship first company. Of course, transactions happen in the course of doing business, and that's wonderful. And we believe that we're going to get enough and we're going to get ours. But when we focus on keeping the relationships healthy and in the right place, it feels like everything else naturally shifts into that right space and that right perspective. And that's part of what we wanted to really explore as well in becoming coachable, with talking about these different leadership styles, that really at its highest and best, we can have this flourishing style leadership. So many people are what we would refer to as risers, people who are creating more value or creating more for people, but it's really primarily focused on themselves. But the shift is that if we can take a more others centric perspective, drawing the circle a little bit bigger and not just seeing ourselves and how can I get more for me, but how can I create more for everyone? How can I be in right relationship with all of the key stakeholders in my life? So, of course, that includes myself, my family, my teammates, my clients and customers, the environment, for people who have a spiritual connection, a higher power. And when all of those things are in right relationship, it's amazing how healthy people really become. And so we always tell people, like our teammates, for example, that you want to be in relationship first. So let's talk about all those core relationships and make sure that everything's right.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. I was so inspired after you shared that last time as well. And just the how empowering that can really be. I think in the transactional world, and I've been learning about this a little bit with a book and work that I'm reading with Caroline Miss. I might be saying that wrong. Hopefully I'm not. But she talks about levels and stages of power. And so how when we're in this like transactional world around stuff, it's very, you're outsourcing your power. And when you start to shift into this now fourth and fifth dimension, you're becoming empowered. And just connecting that to some of the things that you shared got me thinking, and I would love your perspective on this, is I think something that I've noticed in myself and I've heard a lot is this over giving or not going to people pleasing or boundaries. And so I think a fear can be when it is relationship first, which is so powerful. So both you're empowered and you're empowering. And I think those are two really key components in living a really fulfilled and flourishing life. And I think sometimes it can be like a little bit wobbly getting there. What are some tips that people who want to walk that path and make their way towards that flourishing and towards relationship first and less about transactional experiences, what can people do and how do you tap into that discernment? Because if the fear is, oh, I'm gonna continue to overgive, this has happened to me before, I got in trouble this way because I just gave so much of myself, how can you balance those two aspects and be truly empowered and discerning to get to that relationships first way of being?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I feel like I should back up just slightly and say that we have in our book 2x2 grid and a framework for this, where we talk about if it's a x-axis, it starts from me on the left and we on the right. And on the y-axis, it's extractive and then expansive up higher. And so if we look in the lower left corner, that's that corner of it's me focused and it's extractive. We call that striving. And I think that's somewhat self-evident, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. But that's someone who's not having a lot of success, but they're just in it for them. Now, I would say, Katrina, it sounds like you and me probably both tend towards what we would call the people-pleasing side of things. And people-pleasing is that it sounds better because it's we-focused, but it's still ultimately extractive. And I think that's the important thing to recognize about people-pleasing. And part of what makes it extractive is the fact that you're giving away your own agency, your own power, and you're letting other people determine your own self-worth. And I remember when I was in a corporate job, I decided that I was going to be the helper on the team, right? I was going to be the person that was supporting other people in all these different projects. And it wasn't until my boss sat me down several months later and said, listen, it looks like you're so busy helping other people with their work and their projects that you're not actually doing your work and your projects. And that's going to be a problem. And that was a light bulb moment for me where I realized, oh, like yes, it sounds better because all these other people like me and I'm then known as this helper on the team and they can come to me for things and that feels really good. But ultimately, I am not carrying my weight on this team and I'm starting to let everyone else down because I've given so much of my power, energy, and agency away. And that's the real shift into flourishing, is to realize we all have our own part. We do need to be focused on creating more for everyone. It's, of course, seeing the larger vision in what we're doing and helping to bring others along on that, but not in a way that enables them or in a way that drains us, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And so being part of being relationship first is also that oh so important relationship with ourselves.
Yeah, wow, that's an important factor. Yeah, it's not just relationships with others, we are in relationship with ourselves. And so thinking of that in those moments, I think is actually a really great way of discerning. Is this pouring into my cup, their cup, the relationship's cup? And if it's not pouring into one of those cups, then why do it? Like, what's really the driving force? Because maybe that's when you're falling into one of those other quadrants. And I love that. Thank you. That's really helpful. It's been a journey, I'm sure, for so many people, right? Moving from the people pleasing. And one thing I've learned along the way is oftentimes people pleasing, we're doing something we think for somebody else, and it's not actually what they need either. So it actually just becomes energy draining for not really the result even that you're looking for and hoping for. And so being able to ask, yeah, is this pouring into my cup, their cup, the relationship? And I think is so important.
It's such a great point. One of my favorite it's like little tiny book on this is called The Power of Ted. And it talks all about that drama triangle relationship, how there's often a victim and a rescuer and a aggressor. And then it's all about how do you flip that drama triangle and instead have a coach who is supporting the hero in their own
Mm-hmm.
story. And that if we can change from being a rescuer to being more of a coach and an
Mm-hmm.
encourager, that is a really powerful shift as well, to make sure that we're not enabling someone else either. But it's so hard because this is what I've had to realize for myself, is that people who are takers, they don't have a limit, right? Like you could take and take, and it's pretty much a bottomless pit, but ultimately givers do have a limit. At some point you're empty, there's nothing more that you can give. And I think just that realization in my own brain has also helped me realize that I need to make sure to take care of myself, because some other people are never going to be full.
Wow, that's like a mic drop moment right there. That takers don't have a limit. They can just continue to receive and to take. But giving really does have that limit. So yeah, that's super important. What about last question? Then I would love for you to share anything else that you didn't have the opportunity to share. But on this note of receiving and giving and taking, for people that might actually struggle with receiving, that's also a part of allowing their cup to be filled. So I would imagine that's probably an equally important factor of being in that flourishing quadrant. What can help people be open to receiving more, and how does that contribute to them actually being in that flourishing quadrant?
It's actually a beautiful question, and I love the reflection on this. I think people who are not very good at receiving often don't think they're worth it. I think that's often the deep core question or wounding. And so taking time to really analyze that or think about that, and sometimes we treat ourselves worse than the way we would ever treat someone else. And being conscious that if you wouldn't do it to a friend, don't treat yourself that way. If you wouldn't talk to a friend the way you talk to yourself, don't talk to yourself that way. And some of those things, again, with a great coach, a mentor, or just a wonderful friend, we can start to unpack some of those things and become healthier there. But the reality is that one of the best gifts we give the world is to be healthy ourselves. And flourishing is a little bit of a ripple effect, that when other people see us in a healthy place, like a simple example is a parent with their children. If a parent is in a really solid place and knows how to regulate their own needs and emotions, then they're training their kids how to do that, whether they use those words or not. Their kids are observing them. And the same is true when we're leaders. Our people, the people that work for us, are watching us and observing how we respond to situations, and even just the energy that can be transferred. As I'm walking down the streets of New York City and I see someone who smiles at me and I smile back, that energy is contagious, it's transferable, and flourishing can also be that transferable thing. And so when we do some of that work on ourselves, when we ask those important questions, it has a really powerful impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one conclusion that I'm drawing here as well is just how you were saying time doesn't have to just be transactional. Energy is also not necessarily transactional. The more you pour into your own cup, you allow people to pour into your cup, you give from your cup, it doesn't just become this, okay, half emptied, half full. Like there is this ripple of impact, even through a smile or through giving somebody time out of your day, right? These things are not just like super linear and transactional when you do start to move into that flourishing state. And so I love that as a message to end off here as well. And I want to ask if you have anything else that you wanted to share, but I want to do a plug too before you share how people can stay in contact. I absolutely love, Jacqueline, the company that you've co-created and 100 coaches. And I just want to say that anyone that is looking for a coach, especially at the executive level, the positioning I think is very unique in offering that very tailored, important type of coaching at that level, because you have amazing coaches. And I just, yeah, I want to recommend anyone looking for a coach, especially at the executive level, to please be in touch. And then Jacqueline, I'll hand it over to you if there's anything you didn't get to share and how to actually stay in touch with you.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Yeah, I love that. I hope people will actually reach out and stay in touch. Because again, this connection was one of those serendipitous connections. And so I'm delighted that you said something, Katrina, and I hope other people will say something or reach out if there's any way that we can be of support at the agency or otherwise. You can find our book on Amazon and other places. It's just Becoming Coachable by Marshall Goldsmith, Scott Osmond, and myself, Jacqueline Lane. You can also go to becomingcoachable.com and you can see more about our book there. I believe I'll share that you can download the book for free if you go to becomingcoachable.com/downloads. You can download that either EPUB version or PDF. And if you want to learn more about the agency, it's agency.100coaches.com or simply 100coaches.com. We'll take you to learn more about us. You can feel free to reach out there. I'm on LinkedIn. I also recommend following my co-author, Scott Osmond, on LinkedIn. He has a fantastic LinkedIn newsletter that goes out to tens of thousands of people every week. It is really good, and I highly recommend that to anyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'll share everything in the show notes as well, and I will be following up with Scott too and getting on that newsletter myself. So I'm looking forward to that. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us and to share some of your insights, your energy, pour a little bit out from your cup as well. And hopefully you got a little bit back. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and allowing the relationship to continue unfold in all the ways that it will.
Absolutely. I find these conversations to be exponential and multiplying. So absolutely, it is not a pouring out. It is filling up all around. And so here's to flourishing together.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Like what you heard and want more? Stay connected with our community on social media using the links below. Like us on your favorite podcast provider and sign up for the Conscious Loop newsletter, where we only send you goodies with one intent: to break your unconscious loops. If you have an unconscious loop you want to break free from, let us know so we can feature that loop on the show. Info and show notes, and we'll see you next time in the Conscious Loop.